Hello everyone and welcome to video 4 of the cell unit. So this is the first video in the second half of the unit, and in this half of the unit we're going to be talking about all about cellular transport. Okay? So cellular transport is basically how we get things into and out of cells, and this relates very much so to homeostasis. So remember that homeostasis was the maintenance of a constant internal state despite changes in the environment. So in other words, the inside of the body or the inside of the cell is able to stay constant despite everything that's changing outside the body or outside the cell. So these two things are intimately related because we use cellular transport to get things in and out of the cell as we try to maintain an internal balance. So for example, if one of your cells uses up all of its glucose to make energy, we would have to transport more glucose into the cell to use homeostatic mechanisms to come back up to normal, for example. So in this video, or in the next series of videos, we're going to be talking about a whole series of things listed here, but for now we're just going to be focusing on the cell membrane and how this relates to cellular transport. So again, I'm going to define cell transport here as the movement of materials in and out of the cell through the membrane. So obviously, if we have to go through the membrane to get things in and out of the cell membrane is really important for cell transport. And as we already know from our last unit and from earlier in this unit, the membrane is selectively permeable, which means it only lets certain things in and out. So because it can only let certain things in and out, it kind of acts like the gatekeeper, and it controls what goes into and out of the cell. So let's do a little bit of a review. So we already know the cell membrane has many pieces. We know primarily it's a phospholipid bilayer, right? It has 2 layers of phospholipids. But it also has proteins, carbohydrates, and cholesterol all embedded in that phospholipid bilayer. So don't forget, a phospholipid, the structure of that phospholipid, is the glycerol molecule with 2 fatty acids and 1 phosphate group. And remember, this creates 2 different halves of the molecule. So I have these hydrophobic, water-hating, nonpolar tails, and I have this hydrophilic, water-loving, polar head. And because of this orientation, phospholipids end up forming a bilayer in the membrane. So the hydrophilic or water-loving heads face outwards to the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell where the water is. And the hydrophobic tails, that don't mix well with water, point inward. So I have these 2 layers of phospholipids making up the membrane. And we know this is just a review to get us back talking about this. So here's another picture showing you the same thing. So you can see I have the cytoplasm, the inside of the cell, and then the extracellular fluid, the outside of the cell. Both of which are water-based. And I have my hydrophilic heads pointing outward, and then I have my hydrophobic tails pointing inward in my bilayer. So let's go into a little bit more detail about the membrane now, because we know it has some proteins in there. We talked about cholesterol, but we really didn't get down and talk about the details. So there are 2 types of proteins that are found in the membrane. The first type is integral proteins, and you can kind of think integral kind of sounds like integrated, which means to kind of become part of. And these proteins span the entire membrane. If I draw a little membrane over here, these will be proteins that go the whole width. They go from one end to the other. So what I've drawn there is an integral protein. And some examples of these are things like receptors, transport proteins, and enzymes. And we'll see some examples of those on the next slide. The next type is peripheral proteins. Peripheral kind of means on the side. And these are some proteins that are only found on one side of the membrane. And these are always enzymatic. They're always enzymes. Or usually, I should say. And if I added this to my picture, it might be something like this. A protein that's only sitting on one side of the membrane. So let's look at a few examples. So here I have an integral protein, and here, in this case, this is acting as an enzyme. So you can see I have, a substrate coming in, and then the enzyme is changing it and making it into a new molecule. And then I have a second enzyme next to it that this substrate is going into, and it's changing it into a new product. So these are both acting as enzymes. Over here, on the other side, I have several different proteins. You can see I have 2 integral proteins and 1 peripheral protein, and they're all working together as a receptor and enzyme. So you can see here I have a receptor. So a receptor receives a signal. So it's, maybe this is some signaling molecule on the outside of the cell that's binding to my receptor. Okay, and then the receptor protein sends a signal, and the signal tells this enzyme protein to turn this substrate into a new product. So in this case, the enzymatic reaction only happens because the signal activated the whole complex. So here's another example of integral proteins, and in this case, we have transport proteins. So we know that not all things can pass through the membrane, so these are proteins that create little channels to let some of these things get through. In this case, this transport protein over here opens and closes, where this one looks like it's always open. So finally, the last thing about the cell membrane I want to mention is talk about this fluid mosaic model a little bit. We saw this earlier in the unit, but basically this is the idea that the cell membrane it kind of acts like a fluid. All the parts can move laterally, which just means side to side, in the phospholipid bilayer. Because the cell membrane has some unsaturated fatty acids in its phospholipids, those kinks prevent tight packing, so the membrane is very fluid. And the cholesterol kind of helps to perfect the fluidity, so it's not too fluid and not too solid. That's the fluid part of the name. Mosaic just means a bunch of pieces coming together. So because many parts make up the membrane, we also call it a mosaic, because there are a bunch of different molecules making it up. So here is a much more accurate picture of the membrane. So you can see I have a phospholipid bilayer, I have some peripheral proteins, and some of these have little carbohydrate chains popping up of them. I have cholesterol, I also have some integral proteins, all working together. So then finally, the last thing I want to mention in this video is part 2 of our outline, which is the selective permeable nature of the membrane. The fact that the membrane only lets certain things in and out. So when we say selectively permeable, we mean that the membrane only lets some molecules pass through the membranes while others are not able to. We can kind of summarize these into 2 main categories. Things that are small can pass through the membrane because it's easy for them to slip in between the phospholipids, and also things that are hydrophobic can pass through the membrane. And this makes sense because the fatty acid tails create this kind of hydrophobic barrier between the inside and outside of the cell, and therefore only hydrophobic things are going to be able to get through. And remember, by hydrophobic I mean nonpolar. The things that cannot pass through the membrane are things that are very large, things that are charged, because having a charge is very similar to being polar, or things that are polar, because these things will not mix well with the hydrophobic barrier the membrane has created. So that's it for video 4, and I'll see you in video 5.